By the time the buckboard left the last cottonwood behind, Miriam Vane had stopped trying to keep the dust out of her mouth. It found its way past the veil pinned to her hat, settled on her tongue, worked into the seams of her gloves, and turned the black velvet of her traveling suit the color of old brick. The road was hardly a road anymore. Two pale ruts crossed the Arizona country, vanished under stone, then appeared again between stands of creosote and brittle grass. Heat shivered above the ground. The leather water bag hanging under the wagon seat was warm enough to make every swallow taste faintly of metal. Beside her, Geronimo Chatto held the reins in both hands and said nothing. 3 weeks earlier, Miriam had signed her name beneath his on a marriage contract in a railway office in New Mexico. He had not been there. A justice of the peace had witnessed the arrangement. An agent from the territory had explained the terms twice, as if careful repetition might make them less strange. Geronimo owned a cattle ranch west of Silver Creek. Miriam needed a legal household far from Pennsylvania, where a school board scandal had finished what gossip began. Geronimo needed a wife on paper for reasons the agent described only as stability of title and household standing. There had been mention of 3 horses transferred to Miriam's uncle and 2 sacks of flour sent to the family that had taken her in after the dismissal. Miriam had refused to ask whether that made her a bride, a debt, or cargo. Now the man whose name she carried sat close enough that the sleeve of his buckskin shirt brushed hers whenever the wagon dropped into a wash, yet he had not spoken since sunrise. She had heard plenty about him at Fort Cobre, Apache, rancher. Widower, perhaps, though no one seemed certain. Hard man, strange man. A man who paid cash, kept his own counsel, and let white merchants assume he could not read the receipts they pushed across their counters. One lieutenant's wife had lowered her voice and said he had no softness in him at all. Miriam had pretended not to care. After 4 hours of silence, the pretending became tiring. The wagon pitched sharply over a stone shelf. Miriam grabbed the seat rail before she slid sideways. Geronimo pulled the team up at once. He did not reach for her. He waited until she had settled herself, studied the left wheel, then eased the horses around a deeper rut. Miriam looked at his profile. His hair, threaded with a little silver at the temples, was tied at the nape. A pale scar crossed the upper edge of one cheek. He looked neither apologetic nor amused. "You might have warned me," she said. His eyes remained on the road. "I did slow the horses, that was all." His English was rough in the throat, but clear. Miriam folded her hands in her lap and watched the land open before them. Near sundown, the ranch appeared beneath a long ridge of red stone. It was not the lonely shack she had imagined, but neither was it welcoming. A thick-walled adobe house faced a yard packed hard by hooves and boots. Beyond it stood a cedar barn, 2 corrals, a low bunkhouse with no smoke coming from the chimney, and a wind-bent line of fruit trees that seemed to survive from stubbornness rather than water. Cattle moved in the lower pasture like dark seeds scattered across yellow ground. Geronimo drove directly to the barn. The moment the wagon stopped, he climbed down and went to the horses. Miriam remained seated. She waited while he loosened the traces, checked one mare's shoulder, lifted a hoof, and scraped packed clay from the shoe. He worked with calm attention. Not once did he glance toward the wagon. At last Miriam cleared her throat. "My trunk." He straightened. The steamer trunk sat behind the seat under a canvas sheet. It held 2 dresses, a silver-backed brush, her teaching certificate, 6 books, a packet of letters she had not yet found the courage to burn, and the leather ledger she had started on the train west. Geronimo pulled back the canvas, shifted a crate of coffee and salt, then dragged the trunk toward the tailgate. He lowered one end until it rested against the wagon bed. Miriam waited for him to lift it. He stepped away. "Are you leaving it there?" He looked at her then. There was no mockery in his face. That somehow irritated her more. "The house has a door," he said. "I can see that. The floor is inside." She stared at him. He nodded toward the trunk. "If you want your things inside, put them there." For one bright second, she wanted to tell him exactly what sort of man left a woman to drag a trunk after 3 days of rail travel and half a day across desert roads. She had lectured rooms full of boys twice her size. She had faced a school board while 6 men read private correspondence aloud, as if her life were public property. She was not afraid of one silent rancher. But Geronimo had already gone back to the mare. Miriam climbed down. The trunk was heavier than she remembered. The iron corner caught on the wagon step and tore a small strip from her glove. By the time she had dragged it across the yard, sweat ran under her collar and both palms burned. The front door stood open. Inside, the house was dim and cool. The main room held a scarred pine table, 4 chairs that did not match, a cast-iron stove and shelves crowded with jars, tin plates, and folded cloth. A rifle rested above the mantel. A braided rope hung beside the door. Someone had swept recently. She could see the broom marks in the thin layer of dust near the hearth. Geronimo entered behind her, carrying 2 supply crates at once. He set them down. "Your room is there." He pointed to a narrow doorway off the hall. Miriam looked at him. "And yours?" "The other end." Another surprise. She had spent the journey inventing reasons she might need to barricade a door. He crossed to a peg, took down a key, and placed it on the table. "Your room locks from inside." Miriam said nothing. He lifted the coffee crate and carried it toward the pantry. Only after he disappeared did she pick up the key. Her room was small but clean. A narrow bed stood against one wall under a folded wool blanket. There was a washstand, a clay pitcher, a cracked mirror, and a simple desk positioned below the window. No flowers, no curtains, no soft chair. But the mattress had been aired, and someone had placed a fresh bar of lye soap beside the basin. Miriam sat on the bed. The silence pressed against her ears. Back east, silence had meant someone was about to whisper after she passed. It had meant a classroom after the headmaster entered. It had meant her uncle sitting at supper without looking at her, because the board had decided that an unmarried woman, whose letters could be made to sound improper, was unsuitable to teach. Here it contained only the tick of cooling wood, a horse blowing in the yard, and the distant scrape of a shovel. She opened the trunk. Her belongings made 2 small groups on the bed. The first belonged to the woman she had been: the brush, the good gloves, a lace handkerchief, the certificate bearing the seal of the Pennsylvania Academy. The second belonged to the woman who had made it onto the train: pencils, spare nibs, a bottle of iron gall ink wrapped in cloth, and the heavy leather ledger. She opened the ink. The heat had thickened it nearly to paste. Miriam took the cup from the washstand, added 3 careful drops of water, and stirred with the pen. Then she opened the ledger to the first blank page. She had begun it after the scandal, not as a diary but as a way to hold facts still when everyone around her kept changing the story. Dates, names, exact phrases spoken in meetings. The amount of money missing from the school account. The letters Silas Thorne had borrowed and never returned. The morning Arthur Sterling had sworn he would defend her and then advised her to resign before noon. At the top of the page she wrote, "Arrival at the Shadow Ranch." She paused. Through the wall came the sound of Geronimo chopping wood. 3 even blows, a pause. 3 more. She wrote about the road, the heat, the house, the trunk. Then, with more satisfaction than fairness, she wrote that her husband appeared to possess the manners of a gatepost. The next morning, Miriam woke before dawn to the smell of coffee. For several seconds, she did not know where she was. The ceiling was too low, the blanket too rough, the air too dry. Then a pan lid clattered in the kitchen. She dressed quickly and stepped into the main room. Geronimo stood at the stove. He had already lit the fire, filled the water kettle, and sliced yesterday's bread. His sleeves were rolled above his forearms. A small pot of beans warmed beside the coffee. He set a tin cup near the place at the table where she had sat the night before. No greeting, no invitation. Miriam sat anyway. The coffee was black and bitter. She took 1 sip and nearly coughed. Geronimo tore bread in half, put 1 piece on her plate, and kept the other. "Do you always drink it this strong?" she asked. "Yes." "Why?" He considered the question as if it were unexpectedly complicated. "Because it is coffee." Miriam looked down at her cup. She almost smiled, which annoyed her. He finished eating, stood and buckled on his gun belt. "What am I expected to do today?" she asked. He glanced toward the pantry. "Eat, rest, learn where the water is. That is all? For today. I was told you needed a wife. I needed the contract." The answer struck harder than it should have. Miriam put her cup down. "Then you needn't worry. I have no intention of troubling your life." Something moved in his expression. Not anger, perhaps weariness. "I did not say you were trouble. You have said almost nothing." He lifted his hat from the peg. "Words can make trouble faster than horses." Then he went outside. Miriam sat at the table for a long while after the door closed. By mid-morning, the house had grown hot. She washed the breakfast dishes, swept the main room, and found that work did not quiet her mind. Finally, she took the ledger, a pencil, and the small canteen Geronimo had left by the door. A path led north past the corrals. She followed it. The ranch changed when seen on foot. From the wagon, it had looked empty. Walking, she noticed tracks everywhere. Quail scratches beneath brush, coyote prints in a sandy wash, hoof marks hardened around a shallow tank. Small blue flowers grew close to the shade of stones. Lizards flashed between clumps of grass. The air smelled of hot mineral earth and crushed sage. Half a mile from the house, the path dipped into a narrow fold of limestone. There Miriam heard water. Not much. A steady thread slipping over rock. She rounded a stand of juniper and found a spring beneath two old desert willows. Their roots gripped the bank in exposed twists. The pool was no larger than a dining table, clear at the center and green around the edges. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. Miriam sat on a flat stone. For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, no one knew where she was. The thought was frightening for perhaps half a minute. Then it became a relief. She opened the ledger. At first she wrote only what she saw: the angle of the bank, the pale salt crust along one edge, a broken fence post 10 paces east, the way water disappeared beneath a shelf of limestone instead of following the dry wash. Then habit took over and facts became sentences. She wrote that the willow survived by holding its roots where stone cracked. She wrote that the springs seemed too small to matter until one looked at the green it made possible. She wrote that a landscape could appear empty to anyone traveling too fast. When she finally closed the book, the sun had moved past noon. On the walk back, she saw Geronimo repairing the north fence. He was nearly a quarter-mile away, but he raised one arm and pointed toward the house. Miriam frowned. He pointed again, then toward the sky. Only then did she notice the wall of pale dust building in the west. She hurried. The wind hit 5 minutes after she reached the porch. It came hot and hard, carrying grit that rattled against the shutters. Miriam fought one window closed while Geronimo crossed the yard securing the barn doors. He moved from latch to latch without wasted motion. When a loose feed sack tore free, he caught it against the corral rail before it vanished into the storm. By sunset, the wind dropped. Geronimo came inside with dust in his hair and a shallow cut across one hand. Miriam looked at the blood. "You're hurt." He glanced down. "Sit." He did not. She fetched the basin. "Sit," she repeated. This time he did. She washed the cut. It was not deep, but grit had worked into it. Geronimo's hand lay heavy and still in hers, while she picked out 2 black flecks with the tip of a clean needle. "You could have warned me about the storm," she said. I pointed. "That is not the same as speaking." It worked. She looked up. He was watching her. For the first time, there was the faintest suggestion of humor around his eyes. Miriam tied a strip of clean cloth around his palm. "Your system is irritating." "I know." That evening, when she opened the ledger, she began to write that Geronimo Chatto was impossible. She stopped. After a moment, she crossed out the word. Then she wrote, more carefully, that he appeared to believe usefulness was a language sufficient for most human needs. She did not yet know whether she agreed. The first month taught Miriam that the ranch kept time differently from a schoolhouse. There were no bells. Morning began when the eastern windows turned gray and Geronimo's boots crossed the main room. Noon announced itself through heat, the cattle retreating to any scrap of shade, the hinges on the barn too hot to touch barehanded. Evening came with the smell of watered dust around the trough and the dry clicking of insects beginning in the grass. Geronimo did not assign Miriam duties. That irritated her until she realized he was waiting to see what she chose. She chose badly at first. She scorched biscuits because she tried to judge the stove by the clock instead of the heat in the iron. She carried too much water, slipped beside the pump, and bruised her hip. She washed a wool shirt in water, hot enough to shrink it, and spent 2 days stretching the sleeves damp over the backs of chairs. Geronimo made no comment on any of it. The shrunken shirt disappeared into his room. A week later, Miriam saw him wearing it with the sleeves cut off at the elbow. That was somehow worse than being scolded. By the 6th week, she could split kindling without striking the block, tell which hen had hidden eggs under the tool shed, and judge how much flour to use when the air was unusually dry. Her palms hardened. She stopped wearing gloves for ordinary work. One of her black traveling dresses became cleaning cloths after a nail tore the skirt beyond saving. Every few days, she walked to the spring and wrote. The ledger thickened with observations. She mapped the path of shade along the northern ridge because it interested her. She recorded where red silt collected after a brief storm. She noted that the dry wash east of the willows held no running water except after rain, though an old notch in the bank suggested it had once carried more. She gave places names when she did not know their proper ones. The dry whitewash became Skeleton's Path, A split sandstone formation became the broken book. A low shelf above the spring became the reader's step because it was the right height for sitting. Her entries about Geronimo changed more slowly. He continued to speak only when necessary. Move the mare. Storm tonight. Don't touch that snake. Salt is in the second barrel. Yet Miriam began to notice things his silence had hidden when she was determined to dislike him. Each morning he poured her coffee before his own, then added a little more water to hers, because he had noticed she found it too strong. When he butchered a steer, he set aside the liver because she had once mentioned liking it. A loose board on her bedroom floor was replaced while she was at the spring. The cracked mirror on her washstand was mounted in a wooden frame so the sharp edge could not cut her. He never mentioned these things. Miriam never thanked him. Their arrangement seemed to depend on pretending not to notice kindness. One Wednesday afternoon, that arrangement was disturbed by Martha Higgins. Martha arrived in a yellow buggy pulled by a gray pony with too much harness ornament. A cloud of dust followed her all the way to the house. She stepped down carrying a loaf of sourdough wrapped in blue-checked cloth and wearing a lavender dress entirely unsuited to the ranch yard. Miriam was shelling beans on the porch. "Miriam, my dear." Martha kissed the air near her cheek. The scent of rose water and face powder sat strangely above the smell of manure and sun-warmed cedar. "I brought bread. One never knows what sort of provisions a place like this keeps. We have bread. Of course you do." Martha set the loaf on the porch table anyway. She looked toward the corrals. Geronimo was working with a young bay horse, walking it in a slow circle from the ground. Martha lowered her voice. "So it is true." Miriam dropped another bean into the bowl. "What is?" "That he hardly speaks. He speaks, you know what I mean." "I usually don't." Martha smiled with patient sorrow. A look Miriam remembered from women who had visited after the school board dismissed her. "You don't have to defend him to me. Everyone understands why you accepted the arrangement." Miriam's fingers stopped. Martha continued softly. "After what happened with Mr. Thorne, you had few choices, and this is respectable enough, I suppose, legally, but it must be terribly lonely for a woman with your education." Miriam looked toward Geronimo. The bay shied at something near the fence. He did not jerk the rope. He stepped sideways, gave the animal room, then waited until it chose to come closer again. Martha followed her gaze. "They say he used to break men in the mines the same way he breaks horses. Who says that?" "Oh, people." "Which people?" Martha shifted. "You know how towns are." "Yes," Miriam said. "I do." The beans clicked against the enamel bowl. Martha tried another direction. "I only worry. A man without conversation can be difficult to know, perhaps. And a man who cannot read." Miriam looked at her sharply. Martha lifted both hands. "No insult intended. It is simply what everyone says. Everyone." That word had helped ruin Miriam's life more efficiently than any evidence. Everyone said her correspondence with Silas Thorne was improper. Everyone said the missing academy funds proved she had been careless, though she had never controlled the account. Everyone said resignation would preserve some dignity. She picked up a bean pod and split it with her thumbnail. "Geronimo pays his bills, keeps his cattle alive, and has never asked me a question so he could repeat the answer in town. At present, that places him above several educated men I have known." Martha blinked. Miriam emptied the pod. "If Silver Creek is concerned about my loneliness, you may tell Silver Creek I have discovered that quiet is less exhausting than gossip." The visit ended soon afterward. Martha left the bread. Geronimo came to the porch after sunset and found it on the table. He looked at the loaf, then at Miriam. "Gift? Weapon?" He studied the blue cloth. "Can we eat it?" Miriam laughed before she could stop herself. It was not a polite laugh. It came out sudden and rusty from disuse. Geronimo's mouth moved at one corner. They ate half the loaf with supper. 3 days later, Miriam heard a horse running hard toward the yard. She was hanging washed sheets on a line when Geronimo appeared over the rise. A small calf lay across his saddle in front of him, its pale hide streaked red. Miriam dropped the clothespins. Geronimo dismounted and carried the animal into the barn. "What happened? Cat? Mountain lion?" He nodded. The calf was alive, but one hind leg had been torn above the hock. Its eye showed white. Breath fluttered in its nostrils. Geronimo opened a leather roll of tools. Miriam stood near the stall door. "Tell me what you need." "Boiled water, clean cloth." She moved. When she returned, Geronimo had cut away hair around the wound. He washed his hands, threaded a curved needle, and knelt beside the calf. "Hold the head," he said. Miriam crouched in the straw. The calf jerked weakly when the needle went through skin. Geronimo did not murmur to it or stroke its face. His hands worked fast and steady. Pull, knot, cut, wash, another stitch. Miriam watched his expression harden until it seemed almost indifferent. The calf groaned. "Can't you give it a moment?" She snapped. Geronimo's hand stopped. He looked at her. "It is bleeding." "I know. If I stop because it hurts, it dies because I was kind." Miriam flushed. He returned to the wound. She held the calf's head and felt its breath against her wrist. Only after the last stitch was tied did Geronimo sit back. For several seconds he did nothing. Then he placed one hand flat against the calf's ribs. His eyes closed. The barn was quiet except for the animal's rough breathing and flies tapping against the window. Miriam saw his thumb move once against the hide. "Come on," he said, so softly she nearly missed it. The calf breathed in. Geronimo opened his eyes. He stood, carried the animal into a bedded stall and arranged straw beneath the injured leg. Then he mixed a little salt into a pail of water and left it within reach. He noticed Miriam watching. "What?" "Nothing." She looked down. That night her ledger stayed open for an hour before she wrote. She had judged his lack of soothing words as cruelty, because soothing words were the form of mercy she knew. Yet his mercy had been stitches pulled tight, clean water, a stall out of the wind, and a hand against a frightened animal's ribs after no one was watching. Miriam wrote the sentence twice, then disliked both versions and struck them out. The truth was simpler. He had saved what he could. A week later the calf stood. Geronimo said nothing about it, but Miriam saw him stop at the stall every morning. Summer settled over the ranch. The heat drove them into an odd companionship. They worked before sunrise, rested through the worst hours, and returned outside when shadows lengthened. Miriam learned to mend fence. Geronimo learned she could keep accounts faster than he could tally them in his head, though he never handed her his ledgers. That last fact bothered her. She told herself it was because she resented being excluded from useful work. The real reason was uglier. She still believed he had no ledgers worth reading. At Fort Cobre, men had joked that Geronimo signed receipts with an ex-miller at the mercantile spoke to him in slow words. Even Martha's husband had once said, within Miriam's hearing, that Chatto was good with land but not letters. Miriam had begun to reject the cruelty in those judgments. She had not entirely rejected the assumption beneath them. One evening after supper, she opened her leather book at the kitchen table. Geronimo was repairing a bridle near the stove. Miriam wrote about the willow spring, about the pale mineral line around the pool, and the way water vanished into limestone. She described the silence of the house, but no longer called it empty. She wrote that there were forms of attention that left no noise behind. Geronimo rose to put away the bridle. Miriam looked at the page. An impulse came over her. She left the ledger open. Normally, she carried it to her room and locked it in the trunk. Tonight, she closed the inkwell, placed the pen beside the book, and walked away. At her doorway, she glanced back. Geronimo was feeding wood into the stove. He did not look toward the table. Miriam went to bed feeling foolish. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a voice. At first, she thought someone was outside. Then she heard the words clearly through the wall. "Roots hold where the stone has forgotten it can open." Miriam sat upright. The voice was low, careful, and unmistakably Geronimo's. She slipped out of bed. Moonlight lay across the hallway. The kitchen was empty. The voice came from beyond the pantry. Miriam followed it and found a narrow door standing open where she had thought shelves covered the wall. Stone steps descended into darkness. She hesitated, then went down. A tallow candle burned in a cellar beneath the house. Geronimo sat at a small table. Her ledger lay open in his hands. He was reading aloud, not struggling over words, not sounding them out, reading. His voice moved through her sentences with an ease that made her grip the railing. On shelves behind him stood books, dozens of them, no hundreds, law volumes, newspapers tied in bundles, a Spanish dictionary, Blackstone, a worn Shakespeare, Cervantes, survey manuals, a book of Keats with the same blue binding as a volume Miriam's mother had owned. Geronimo turned a page. Miriam stepped off the last stair. The board creaked. He stopped. Their eyes met. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Geronimo closed the ledger. Miriam's face burned. "You can read." He looked at the book in his hands. "Yes." "All this time, yes. You let me believe. I did not tell you what to believe." The answer stung because it was true. Miriam came farther into the cellar. "Why?" Geronimo set the ledger on the table. The candle made deep shadows under his eyes. "Which question? Why pretend you can't read? Why let men talk to you that way? Why hide this?" He leaned back slightly. When I was a boy, a clerk at the agency changed one number on a ration list. Families lost food, my uncle argued. The clerk showed him paper and said paper was truth. Geronimo touched the edge of a law book. My uncle could not read the number. The clerk knew it. Miriam said nothing. I learned Spanish first from an old priest. English from newspapers, soldiers' books, freight labels. Law from men who thought no Apache in the room understood them. His mouth tightened. People speak freely in front of a man they believe is stupid. The cellar seemed suddenly smaller. Miriam looked at the shelves. You have allowed them to think you are less than you are. I have allowed them to be careless. And me? That was the question beneath all the others. Geronimo looked directly at her. At first I did not know if you were staying. The answer was quiet. Miriam folded her arms. So you tested me. I watched. You read my private book? Yes. You could have asked. Would you have answered? She opened her mouth, closed it. He pushed the ledger toward her. I should have asked. The plain apology unsettled her more than an excuse would have. Miriam put a hand on the leather cover, but did not take it yet. Why were you reading it aloud? Geronimo looked away for the first time. To hear where your sentences turn. She stared. He reached for a different page. You write about the spring as if it is sad. I write many things badly when I'm angry. The writing is not bad. A flush rose into her face. Geronimo tapped a paragraph. You noticed salt on the east bank. You noticed water disappearing under limestone. You noticed the dry wash does not carry living water. Miriam frowned. Of course. Most people don't. He stood and crossed to a locked wooden chest. From it he removed a roll wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it beside her ledger and unwrapped an old parchment. The paper was yellow-brown, the writing faded Spanish, a seal pressed near the bottom. Miriam leaned closer. What is it? The grant that tells men like Silas Thorne they do not own my spring. Her head came up. He knew the name. Geronimo's expression did not change. Your past came to this ranch before you did. Outside, somewhere above them, the wind moved against the house. Miriam stared at the old document, then at the man she had believed could not read her simplest page. For the first time since arriving, she understood that the deepest secret in the house had never been hers. Miriam did not sleep again that night. She sat with Geronimo in the cellar until the candle guttered low, reading the Spanish grant line by line. The document had been issued generations earlier, when boundaries in the valley were described by things that existed in the world, rather than by neat measurements on a surveyor's grid. From the Willow Spring to the Red Ridge, along the channel of living water, south to the split basalt stone, west by the old Cottonwoods. Some landmarks were gone, others remained. Geronimo knew everyone. He kept a newer territorial map pinned to the wall. Pencil marks covered its margins. Who is challenging it? Miriam asked. Silas Thorne's syndicate. Her stomach tightened. She sat back. Geronimo saw the movement. You know him? Yes. More than the newspapers say. She looked at him sharply. What newspapers? He nodded toward a tied stack on the shelf. Miriam rose and pulled out the top bundle. The papers were months old, some from Philadelphia. She found her own name in one before she had unfolded it completely. Former Academy Instructor Resign's Amid Inquiry. Her hand went cold. Geronimo remained by the table. You collected these? I collect news that reaches the territory. You knew who I was before the contract. Yes. The old humiliation returned so quickly that Miriam almost tasted the varnished schoolroom where the board had questioned her. Then why marry me? Geronimo considered his answer. Because Thorne wanted you gone. That is not a reason. It is when the same man wants my land. Miriam stared at him. He pulled another document from his files. It was a letter from a territorial agent to Harlan Graves, a surveyor. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but Thorne's company name appeared twice. The syndicate has been buying claims along the basin, Geronimo said. Mostly land with water. Old deeds are easiest to attack. Men disappear. Papers disappear. Boundaries change. And you thought I could help. I thought you might know how Thorne works. Miriam laughed once without humor. I know exactly how he works. Geronimo waited. She had told no one at the ranch the full story. She had barely told the justice of the peace enough to explain why she needed to leave the East. Now the cellar, with its earth-cool walls and shelves of hidden books, felt safer than any drawing room she had known. Silas was a trustee at the academy, she said. He funded a new library wing. He liked to speak about educating women when there were donors in the room. Geronimo's face remained still. He also liked private letters. Miriam folded the newspaper. He courted me for almost a year. though he never said the word marriage. He asked about the school's finances, about which board members quarreled, about the families who might support expansion. I thought he respected my mind. Her throat tightened, but she continued. When I discovered money missing from a scholarship fund, I wrote to Arthur Sterling. He was a lawyer and an old friend. I asked him how to protect the students before I accused anyone. Silas somehow obtained the letters. Sterling gave them to him. I believe so. What did the letters say? Enough to be rearranged. She looked at the lamp flame. I had written that Silas was dangerous. In another letter I wrote that I had once cared for him. The board was shown selected pages. By the end, I was not the teacher reporting theft. I was a rejected woman seeking revenge. Geronimo's jaw tightened. The missing money? Never recovered. Thorne? Promoted. He joined a land investment company 6 months later. Geronimo sat very still. Miriam finally took back her ledger. So yes, I know how Silas works. He does not need a lie to be convincing. He needs a truth cut into useful pieces. For a while the only sound was the candle wick. Then Geronimo said, "That is how a false map works too." Miriam looked at him. He placed the territorial map beside her spring notes. A true ridge, a true wash, a true spring. Move one line, rename one thing. The theft looks official. Miriam bent over the papers. For the next 2 hours they worked. Her private observations, written because she had felt useless, suddenly mattered. The salt trace she had described corresponded to a notation on the old grant. The angle of the limestone shelf matched a survey sketch copied in Geronimo's notebook. Her skeleton's path appeared on a newer map under another name, Highwater Creek. Miriam frowned. That cannot be right. What this? She put a finger on the map. Highwater Creek. If this is the wash I walk through to reach the willow, it is dry most of the year. It is dry all but storm season. Then why mark it as permanent water? Geronimo's gaze sharpened. Because permanent water can define a boundary. Miriam felt the meaning settle. And if they pretend the wash is the boundary? The spring moves outside my grant on paper. She looked from the map to him. But the spring itself hasn't moved. No, a strange excitement pushed through her fatigue. This is absurd. Absurd things become law when no one brings the stone into the room. Miriam looked again at the pages she had written at the spring. The phrase pleased and frightened her. She had spent months believing language was the last thing she possessed from her old life. Now language and landscape appeared to be parts of the same weapon. Near dawn, Geronimo brought her upstairs. The kitchen looked altered, though nothing had changed. The same stove, the same table, the same cup, with a dent near the rim. He poured coffee for both of them. This time, he sat across from her instead of eating quickly and leaving. "The wind will turn north today," he said. Miriam lifted her cup. His voice in ordinary conversation still startled her. "The cattle should use the lower draw, then." He nodded. A pause. "Your coffee is weaker than mine," he added. "I noticed. I thought you had." She looked over the rim of the cup. "How long?" "Second morning. And you said nothing. You kept drinking it." Miriam shook her head. "You are infuriating. That also I know." This time they both smiled. The change between them did not become sudden intimacy. Geronimo did not transform into a talkative man simply because his secret had been discovered. Miriam did not forgive the invasion of her journal in a single night. She moved the ledger back to her room and told him plainly that he was not to read it again without permission. He answered, "All right." Then, 2 days later, she carried it into the cellar herself. That was different. She began to ask questions about the books. He had purchased some from estate sales in mining camps. Others came from soldiers who needed cash. A former Jesuit had traded him 3 Spanish law volumes for a mule. Blackstone had cost him almost a month's cattle profit. "Do you like poetry?" Miriam asked one evening. Geronimo looked offended by the imprecision of the question. "Some. That is evasive. It is accurate." She pulled Keats from the shelf. "This?" He shrugged. "You were reading my prose aloud but refused to admit whether you like Keats?" "I like parts." "Which parts?" He took the book from her, found a marked page, and held it out. Miriam read the poem at the table upstairs while he repaired a saddle strap. His finger tapped once against the leather in time with the meter. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. Neither mentioned it. A week later, they were sharing the kitchen table after supper when Geronimo slid a small notebook toward her. His handwriting was controlled, angular, and compact. Miriam turned pages, dates, deed numbers, names of clerks, purchase prices, water flows, cattle counts, notes on law. "You have been doing this for years." 15. "Why didn't you show me sooner?" "Because you called my house an intellectual graveyard." Miriam froze. He had read that page. Heat climbed her neck. I was angry. You were precise. I was arrogant. Also precise. She closed the notebook. I'm sorry. Geronimo looked at her for several seconds. Then he said, You carried your own trunk after 3 days on a train. I was not generous. That was the closest either of them came to settling the debt. Their private alliance had just begun when Harlan Graves arrived. His wagon appeared around noon, throwing a plume of yellow dust across the flats. Graves wore a pale linen coat despite the heat and had a brass transit packed behind the seat. Geronimo saw him first. He was coiling rope near the corral. Surveyor, he said. Miriam came to the porch. Thorns? Yes. Graves climbed down and brushed dust from his trousers with visible irritation. Mr. Chatto. Geronimo gave a short nod. Graves raised his voice, though he stood less than 10 feet away. Territorial verification. Water and boundary census. I need access to your northern lines and primary spring. Miriam felt anger before he had finished. Geronimo's face changed, not visibly to Graves perhaps, but Miriam saw it. His shoulders loosened, his gaze dropped slightly. The alert intelligence she knew retreated behind the familiar public mask. Water there, he said, pointing north. The broken grammar was deliberate. Graves smiled. Yes, I gathered that. He glanced at Miriam as though expecting complicity. Mrs. Chatto, perhaps you can explain that the Territorial Property Act requires cooperation. Miriam almost answered. Geronimo looked at her. One eyelid lowered for the briefest instant, a wink. Miriam bit the inside of her cheek. I believe my husband heard you, she said. Graves seemed disappointed. For 3 hours he measured the ranch. Geronimo accompanied him carrying a survey chain. He moved slowly when Graves watched. He asked no questions. When Graves discussed bearings with his assistant, Geronimo stared toward the cattle as though bored. Miriam watched from the shade and wrote down everything. At the willow spring, Graves placed the transit on the wrong side of a limestone shelf. Miriam noticed. Geronimo noticed her noticing. Neither spoke. Near evening, Graves returned to the house. He spread a preliminary map across the kitchen table without asking permission. A heavy pencil line cut through the northern pasture. According to the updated territorial coordinates, this spring falls outside the Chatto holding. Miriam leaned over the map. No. Graves looked at her with patient amusement. The instrument does not have an opinion, Mrs. Chatto. The ridge is wrong. The ridge is exactly where the Federal Survey places it. I walked it yesterday. He smiled. Walking is not surveying. Geronimo stood by the door. Graves tapped the map. The land between Highwater Creek and the northern ridge is unrecorded acreage, ghost acreage in common speech. If the final review confirms these measurements, title reverts to public domain. And then? Miriam asked. Then it may be purchased. By whom? Graves folded his transit notes. That is not my office. Silas Thorne's syndicate. For the first time his expression shifted, only slightly. Enough. He rolled the map but left a carbon copy. I'll return in 48 hours with the formal notice. The wagon departed in the evening dust. Miriam stood at the table staring at the copy. Geronimo closed the door. She spread her ledger beside the map. Skeleton's Path is here, she said. Her finger followed the dry wash she knew. Graves has drawn Highwater Creek here. The two lines diverged by nearly 60 yards near the willow. Geronimo took out his pencil. He moved the wash, not the wash, the name. He looked at her. Miriam's pulse quickened. That's how Silas does it. He doesn't invent everything. He changes the label that controls the meaning. Geronimo put a finger on the map. Then we prove the name is false. How? He looked toward the north window where the ridge had gone purple in the setting sun, with the land. Miriam closed the ledger, and with the old grant. Geronimo nodded. For the first time, the words came naturally. We'll need both. The next morning, Miriam traded her skirt for the oldest one she owned, tied her hair under a plain scarf, and followed Geronimo toward the northern ridge, carrying a measuring chain, pencils, and the ledger. They did not take the wagon. Geronimo said wheels made people lazy about distance. Miriam told him that was exactly the sort of sentence a man said when he did not have to carry a ledger, canteen, and 20-pound chain without a word. He took the chain from her. She decided not to point out the contradiction. They began at the willow spring. Geronimo showed her where the old grant's language matched the land. A narrow vein of pale mineral crust ran through the limestone east of the pool. An ancient notch cut into a rock face marked the place where an irrigation channel had once begun. 50 paces north stood the remains of 2 stone posts almost swallowed by brush. Boundary markers? Miriam asked. Maybe, that is not encouraging. Stone does not sign affidavits. It would be easier if it did. He gave her the end of the chain. They measured. Miriam recorded distance, angle, and direction. She sketched the shape of the bank. Geronimo climbed the ridge and called down bearings, using a pocket compass older than either of them. At each point where Graves's map differed from the ground, they drove a short cedar stake. By noon they had 3. The first proved Highwater Creek was not where Graves had drawn it. The second showed the supposed permanent watercourse ended in a basin of bone-dry gravel. The third stood beside a shelf of limestone from which the true spring emerged well inside the older Grant boundary. Miriam crouched over her notes. He must have known. Geronimo drank from the canteen and passed it to her. Graves has worked this valley 12 years. Then there is no mistake. No, she drank. The water was warm, but the wind had begun to change. Clouds built over the high country, tall and gray-white. Miriam looked at the stakes. Can we prove deliberate fraud? Harder, we have his copy. He will say preliminary error. Silas will say Graves corrected it before filing. Geronimo nodded. She chewed the end of her pencil. At the academy, boys used to laugh when she did that, while working through difficult translations. She had stopped for years, because Silas once called the habit unbecoming. Now she bit the wood hard enough to dent it. We need something he cannot correct after the fact. Geronimo looked toward Skeleton's path, the land after rain. Miriam followed his gaze. What do you mean? If the storm comes, the wash will run. That helps Graves. No, watch where it runs. The clouds thickened. They worked until the first wind reached them. Dust moved low across the ground. A raven lifted from the ridge and disappeared south. Geronimo gathered the tools, home. This time Miriam did not argue. Rain reached the ranch at dusk. It began in scattered drops that struck the porch boards hard enough to leave dark circles. Then the sky opened. Water hammered the roof. The gutters overflowed. The yard became a sheet of moving mud. Miriam stood at the kitchen window. Geronimo pulled on his coat. Where are you going? North Wash. In this? He tied a rope around his waist. Miriam stared. You are not going alone. I am. No. He looked at her. She grabbed her own coat. You told me we needed to watch where the water runs. If I am to testify to what I see, I intend to see it. Lightning flashed beyond the ridge. Geronimo's jaw worked. Finally, he handed her the other end of the rope. Stay behind me. They rode 2 horses to the lower trail and walked the last quarter-mile. Rain turned the world silver. Water streamed from Miriam's hat brim and down her neck. The ground that had been dust that morning pulled at her boots. At Skeleton's path, a brown torrent rushed through the white gravel, but it did not flow where Graves's map claimed. The water entered from a side canyon, ran south for less than 200 yards, then disappeared into fractured limestone. The Willow Spring lay above and west of the wash, fed from another source entirely. Miriam could have shouted. Instead, she took out the oilskin-wrapped notebook Geronimo had insisted she carry and wrote under the shelter of a rock overhang. Time, direction, depth, point of disappearance. Geronimo hammered a stake at the last visible flow. Look, he said. Lightning flashed. Across the slope, water spilled from beneath the limestone shelf and poured directly into the Willow Basin. 2 separate systems. The evidence was visible for anyone willing to get wet. Miriam laughed. Rain ran into her mouth. What? Geronimo asked. Graves picked the one day of the year when his lie could have looked true, and it still doesn't. Geronimo's face softened. Paper is easier than weather. They returned soaked and shivering. Inside, Geronimo built the fire while Miriam peeled off wet stockings near the stove. Neither seemed embarrassed by the ordinary intimacy of sharing a room in miserable clothes. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and set her notebook on the table to dry. Geronimo brought 2 bowls of bean stew. His hand shook slightly from cold. Miriam pushed his bowl toward him. Eat before you become noble and freeze to death. He sat. I was not noble. No, I wanted the evidence. Good. I distrust noble men. He looked at her. She realized what she had said. Silas had been noble in public. Arthur had been honorable in language. The school board had spoken for an hour about protecting standards before throwing her out. Geronimo ate a spoonful of stew. So do I, he said. The storm lasted 3 days. By the second morning, the high ridges were white with wet snow. The ranch became a small island of smoke and chores. They broke ice from the trough, moved feed under cover, and checked the injured calf twice a day. After dark, they worked at the kitchen table. Miriam copied the Grant Spanish into clear English. Geronimo compared old boundary phrases with his notes. Occasionally, they argued. The phrase is living water, Miriam said. It means water that remains. Legally, perhaps. Literally, it may also distinguish flowing water from stored water. Geronimo leaned closer to the parchment. The old people who cut the ditches did not care about your dictionary. Fortunately for us, the judge might, he grunted. That was a grammatical victory, Miriam said. It was a small one. I will take it. Late on the third evening, Geronimo went outside to secure the lean-to roof. Miriam searched the shelf for a Spanish reference and pulled down a battered copy of Don Quixote. A folded scrap of paper slipped from between the pages. She bent to pick it up. The handwriting was Geronimo's, but unlike his neat legal notes, the lines were pressed deep and uneven. She should not have read it. She knew that before her eyes reached the second sentence. Yet she did. It was not addressed to anyone. The fragment described her voice when she read at the table. He had written that it changed the house, that certain words remained after she stopped speaking, as rain smell remained on stone after the ground was dry. Then one line caught her. She brings water into rooms I had forgotten were thirsty. Miriam sat down. The paper trembled in her fingers. Footsteps sounded on the porch. Geronimo entered with snow melting on his shoulders. He saw the book, then the paper. His face changed completely. The man who could stand expressionless while Graves insulted him looked suddenly exposed. Miriam rose. I found this. Geronimo removed his gloves slowly. I see. I did not mean to, but you read it. Yes, he turned toward the stove. Miriam recognized the motion for what it was, retreat. She crossed the room. Geronimo. He stopped. Your legal hand is neater. He looked at her confused. Miriam held out the paper. This is a terrible piece of penmanship. A long pause. Then he exhaled through his nose. I know, the line about water is good. His eyes shifted away. Miriam's chest tightened at the sight. You can stand before a dishonest surveyor and let him call you stupid to your face, but you're ashamed of a sentence? Law has rules, so does language. Not the same kind, no. She moved closer. Law tells you where to stand. A sentence can show someone where you already are. Geronimo looked at the paper. I did not plan for you to see it. I understand. You should forget it. I won't. He frowned. That was not the answer I wanted. Then you should have married a more obedient teacher. Something like a laugh escaped him. Miriam placed the paper in his palm. Her fingers remained over his for a moment. Your handwriting does not change whether it is true. His thumb moved once against the side of her hand. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Outside, snow slid from the roof with a heavy thump. Geronimo folded the paper and returned it to Don Quixote. Miriam returned to the table. After a while, she picked up the Keats volume. Would you like me to read? He sat across from her. Yes, she read until the fire burned low. The following morning, a writer arrived from Silver Creek with a sealed envelope. The formal notice had come. Geronimo broke the seal at the kitchen table. Miriam watched his eyes move over the page. The territorial syndicate claimed the northern tract under a ghost acreage provision. Drawing water from the Willow Spring was to cease in 48 hours. A hearing would be held in Silver Creek to confirm seizure. At the bottom was Silas Thorne's signature. Miriam stared at it. The old fear appeared first, quick, cold, automatic. Then anger replaced it. Geronimo folded the notice. We ride tomorrow. Miriam put both palms on the table. No. First we prepare. He looked at her. She opened the ledger, pulled the rain notes closer, and pointed to the old grant. Silas ruined me once because he decided which pieces of the story everyone would hear. I will not allow him to choose the pieces again. Geronimo sat. Miriam dipped her pen. What does the judge know about the grant? Probably only what Thorne filed. Then we begin there. For the rest of the day, they built their case. Silas Thorne arrived before they could leave for Silver Creek. The black carriage came up the ranch road shortly after noon, glossy against the dull winter ground. Its driver wore a city coat. The horses were matched bays, too fine-boned for ranch work, and brushed until their coats shone. Miriam saw the carriage from the kitchen window. For 1 second she was back in Pennsylvania, a polished hallway. Gas lamps. Silas leaning against the academy office door with his hat in his hands, telling her that clever women frightened ordinary men, and that he was grateful she had never learned to make herself smaller. She had believed the compliment. That memory made her angrier than the sight of him. Geronimo was in the barn. Miriam stepped onto the porch alone. Silas climbed from the carriage wearing a dark wool suit and gloves the color of cream. The desert had already found his boots. Fine dust dulled the toes. He smiled. She did not return it, Silas. His eyes moved over her dress, her work apron, the loose strand of hair at her cheek. I confess, I had prepared myself for worse. You usually do prepare yourself for whatever story suits you. His smile narrowed. Still sharp. Why are you here? He looked past her toward the house. A man may visit an old friend. We were never friends. That is cruel. It is accurate. Silas sighed as though she were a difficult student. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed letter. I brought something I thought you deserved to see before tomorrow. Miriam did not take it. What is it? Restoration. The word sat between them. Silas broke the seal himself and unfolded the paper. The Academy Board has reconsidered the circumstances surrounding your resignation. There is a position available. Head of the upper school. Your full standing restored. Miriam's heart gave one hard beat. Silas watched her face. He had always been good at watching the exact moment desire made someone vulnerable. You arranged this. I encouraged reason. You encouraged something. It is a generous salary. He held out the letter. Miriam looked at the elegant school seal. For years she had imagined such a document. An apology. A correction. Her name returned to the place from which it had been scraped. She pictured shelves of books, clean desks, the chalk tray beneath a blackboard. She pictured winter rain against glass instead of dust against shutters. Then she noticed Silas's thumb covering the bottom paragraph. Move your hand. He blinked. The paragraph, Miriam, move it. His hand shifted. The final line stated that reinstatement would take effect upon her return to Pennsylvania and termination of the irregular territorial marriage presently recorded under the name Chateau. Miriam laughed. Silas's face hardened. You came all this way with a bribe. I came with an exit. From what? He gestured toward the yard. This. A gust moved through the creosote. Silas lowered his voice. You were meant for rooms where people understand you. Look at yourself. You have dirt under your nails. You live with a man who lets half the territory believe he cannot spell his own name. Miriam went very still. Silas saw something in her face and mistook it for shame. He stepped closer. Come back with me. Tomorrow's hearing is unpleasant business, but it need not touch you. The syndicate's claim is against Chateau. Your marriage can be dissolved. You can leave before the court confirms seizure. So that is the bargain. It is not a bargain. It has two sides and a price. His mouth tightened. Miriam, be sensible. That ranch is going to be broken apart. The spring controls the basin. Investors have spent too much money to walk away because an Apache cattleman waves an antique paper. From inside the barn came the sound of a hammer stopping. Miriam knew Geronimo could hear them. Silas continued. Do you really intend to throw away your future for him? She looked at the school letter again. The ache it caused was real. That mattered. If she felt nothing, refusing would be easy and therefore meaningless. She remembered the day she had left the academy. No one had helped carry her box of books down the stairs. Arthur Sterling had looked through her as though shame were contagious. Silas had sent a note 2 days later offering money for travel if she agreed not to dispute the board's statement publicly. Geronimo had made her carry her own trunk too. But he had given her a key to a room and never entered without permission. He had let her hate him until she had evidence enough to change her mind. He had never once asked her to become smaller so he could rescue her. Miriam took the school letter. Silas's shoulders relaxed. She tore it once down the center. His expression emptied. She tore it again. The pieces fluttered to the porch. You are making a mistake. Possibly. Out of pride? No. She stepped down from the porch until they stood on the same ground. I am staying because this is the first place where my usefulness does not require my obedience. Silas's face reddened. You think he sees you as an equal? I don't have to think it. That man bought your contract, and you bought a school board. The blow landed. Silas's eyes sharpened. You have no proof of what happened in Pennsylvania. Not enough then. Not enough now. No. Miriam said, but tomorrow is not about Pennsylvania. She nodded toward the northern ridge. It is about a surveyor who moved a watercourse 60 yards on paper because you believed no one here would know how to challenge the language. For the first time, Silas lost color. Only a little. Enough. Miriam saw it and knew they were right. He recovered quickly. You have been playing at law. No, I've been looking at the ground. Silas glanced toward the barn. Geronimo stood in the open doorway. He had not approached. His coat was dusty. A hammer hung loose in one hand. Silas smiled toward him, but the expression had become brittle. Does he even know what we're discussing? Geronimo said nothing. Miriam looked back at Silas. You should continue believing he doesn't. Silas's gaze moved between them. Something uncertain entered his face. He turned toward the carriage. At the step, he paused. "The judge in Silver Creek is not one of your pupils, Miriam. He will not be impressed by descriptions of willow trees." "No," she said, "but he may be interested in fraud." Ancillus climbed into the carriage. The wheels threw mud and dust as it turned. Miriam watched until the black shape disappeared beyond the rise. Only then did she realize her hands were shaking. Geronimo crossed the yard. He looked at the torn letter pieces. "Head of the school, you heard." "Yes." "You're supposed to pretend not to." "That is for enemies." Miriam bent to pick up the paper. Geronimo crouched and gathered the other pieces. They carried them inside. At the stove, Miriam fed the letter to the fire one strip at a time. Geronimo stood beside her. "You wanted it," he said. "It was not accusation." Miriam watched the school seal curl black. "Part of me did." He nodded. "You could still go." She looked at him. "Do you want me to?" His answer took too long. Miriam's chest tightened. Then he said, "Want and right are not the same." "What do you want?" He stared into the fire. This was harder for him than any legal question. At last he said, "I want you to stay because you choose the house, not because you have nowhere else." Miriam's eyes burned. She looked away before he could see too much. "I chose." Geronimo placed one charred scrap deeper into the coals with the poker. "Then we have work." They spent the afternoon preparing exhibits. Miriam copied the rain observations in a clear hand. She numbered the cedar stakes on a sketch map. Geronimo laid the old Spanish grant between two sheets of clean cloth and packed it into a wooden document box. At dusk he practiced what he intended to say, not because he lacked English, but because public speech was another kind of terrain. For years he had cultivated the clipped phrases people expected. Speaking fully in court meant abandoning a disguise that had protected him. He stood near the table. The territorial map identifies Skeleton's Path as a perennial watercourse. "Too fast," Miriam said. He stopped. "If they are expecting you to stumble, don't give them speed to call confusion." He tried again. "The territorial map identifies Skeleton's Path as a perennial watercourse." "Better." Geronimo frowned. "You sound like the headmistress." "I nearly was one. Terrifying." She pointed her pencil at him. Again, he practiced names, dates, and legal phrases until darkness filled the windows. When he reached Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, his pronunciation was already better than hers. Miriam lowered the pencil. "You did not need my help with that." "No. Then why did you let me correct you for 10 minutes? A slow smile appeared. "You looked happy." Miriam threw the pencil at him. He caught it. They both laughed. The laughter faded naturally, leaving something warmer behind. Later, when the documents were packed and the kitchen swept, Geronimo sat with both hands around a cup he had forgotten to drink. Miriam recognized the stillness. "What is it?" He looked toward the shuttered window. "Tomorrow they will see me speak and decide I am dangerous for knowing what they thought I did not." "They already decided you were dangerous. Different kind." She sat opposite him. He rubbed his thumb over a scar on one knuckle. "A man can survive being underestimated. Sometimes being known costs more." Miriam understood. Her own ruin had begun when private words became public evidence stripped of context. "What would you do if we lost?" she asked. "Move cattle south, fight the appeal. Dig another well if there is water. And if there isn't," he looked at her, "keep going." There was no heroic certainty in it, only habit. Miriam reached across the table. Her hand stopped before touching his. Geronimo turned his palm upward. The invitation was small, unmistakable. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. "The judge may not listen at first," she said, "so we make him look at something he cannot unsee. The false creek, the spring, the old grant. Graves' own measurements if we can force him to answer." Geronimo nodded. "And Thorn?" Miriam thought of the torn letter. "Silas believes shame is the same thing as silence." She squeezed Geronimo's hand. "He is going to discover the difference." Before dawn they loaded the wagon. The grant went beneath the seat in its box. Miriam's ledger rested in her satchel. Geronimo carried his 15 years of notes inside his coat. When the house was secured, Miriam looked back at the porch. The place no longer resembled the prison she had described on her first night. It looked plain, weathered, vulnerable to fire, drought, dishonest men and time. It looked worth returning to. Geronimo held out his hand to help her onto the wagon. Miriam paused. Months ago he had left her to climb down alone. He remembered. She could tell by the way his eyes flicked toward hers. Miriam took his hand. "Your manners are improving. Don't tell Martha. I would never damage your reputation." He climbed up beside her. They turned the team toward Silver Creek. Silver Creek had no proper courthouse. Land hearings were held in the largest room of the territorial office, a two-story timber building squeezed between the assay office and a saloon. On busy days, benches were carried outside beneath the overhang because the hearing room could not hold everyone who came to watch other people's trouble. By the time Miriam and Geronimo arrived, half the town seemed to be waiting. Horses stood tied along the rail. Men from neighboring ranches leaned against porch posts. Women occupied the front benches under hats and parasols, despite the weak winter sun. Martha Higgins sat near the door. She saw Miriam climb down from the wagon with Geronimo's hand at her elbow. Her eyebrows rose. Miriam almost smiled. Inside, the room smelled of dust wool lamp oil and too many bodies. Judge Amos Bell sat behind a high desk that had once belonged to a bank. He was heavy through the shoulders, gray-haired and tired-looking. Miriam knew nothing about his loyalties. Silas had once said tired men were easiest to purchase because they mistook convenience for peace. At the opposite table stood Silas Thorne. Arthur Sterling was beside him. Miriam stopped. Arthur looked older than she remembered. His hair had thinned and his spectacles were thicker, but the nervous habit of rubbing his thumb along the edge of a document was the same. Their eyes met. Arthur looked away first. Something inside Miriam settled. Silas did not acknowledge the previous day's visit. He bowed politely. Mrs. Chatto, Mr. Thorne. Harlan Graves sat behind him with a leather case of survey notes. Geronimo took the chair beside Miriam. A clerk called the hearing to order. Silas spoke first. He was excellent. Miriam had forgotten how excellent. He did not sneer. He did not insult Geronimo openly. He did not sound greedy. He sounded reasonable. The territory, he explained, had inherited conflicting systems of land description: Spanish grants, Mexican records, federal surveys, mining claims, and homestead filings. Errors were inevitable. The ghost acreage provision existed to clarify tracts that could not be reliably tied to current coordinates. He displayed Graves's final map. The northern section of the Chatto Ranch was shaded blue. The disputed tract contains the only dependable spring serving approximately 1,200 acres of otherwise underutilized land, Silas said. My clients seek lawful title so the water may support broader agricultural development. Broader development. Miriam wrote the phrase in the margin of her notes. Silas continued. He described the Spanish grant as historically interesting but geographically uncertain. He called the Willow Spring an unverified colloquial landmark. He cited a federal survey that placed the boundary along Highwater Creek. Then he called Harlan Graves. Graves took the chair. Under questioning from Arthur Sterling, he described his transit, chain, and bearings. He spoke of magnetic declination and standardized coordinates. He explained that modern instruments corrected the vagueness of old descriptions. Silas held up the map. In your professional opinion, where is the Willow Spring? Outside the Chatto allotment. And Highwater Creek? The natural northern boundary. Permanent water? Graves hesitated less than a heartbeat. Seasonally diminished, but historically persistent. Miriam felt Geronimo shift beside her. Silas finished. The judge looked toward their table. Mr. Chatto, are you represented by counsel? Geronimo stood. No, a whisper ran through the room. His voice was not the clipped public rasp people expected. Judge Bell looked over his spectacles. Do you intend to represent yourself? With my wife assisting on the record. Another murmur. Geronimo waited until it stopped. Miriam saw Graves's face change. Silas remained still. But Arthur stared at Geronimo as though a chair had spoken. Judge Bell leaned back. Very well. Geronimo walked to the open space before the desk. He did not begin with law, he began with a question. Mr. Graves, how many years have you surveyed this basin? Graves cleared his throat. 12. Have you seen Skeleton's Path? I don't recognize that informal name. Geronimo handed the clerk Miriam's sketch. The dry wash east of the Willow Spring, the one you call Highwater Creek. Graves looked at the drawing. I have surveyed it. How many months each year does water flow there? Silas stood. Objection. The witness has already characterized seasonal variation. Judge Bell frowned. I'd like an answer. Graves adjusted his spectacles. It varies. Last year, I did not observe it continuously. This year, no surveyor observes a creek every day. Geronimo nodded. Did you see water when you surveyed my land? No, a small movement passed through the room. Geronimo asked, did you see evidence of perennial flow, water plants, a cut bank, saturated soil? Graves's mouth tightened. There were geomorphic indications. Which ones? Stone channeling, depositional patterns. Miriam opened her ledger. Geronimo glanced at her. It was time. She stood. Your Honor. May I place an observation record into evidence? Silas rose again. A private diary? A dated field ledger, Miriam said. He smiled. Written by the claimant's wife, yes. Judge Bell held out a hand. The clerk carried him the book. Miriam's stomach turned as another man opened her private pages. This time she had chosen it. That made all the difference. She had marked only the relevant sections with strips of cloth. Judge Bell read the first. Miriam explained that she had walked the northern acreage several times a week since arriving at the ranch. She described the willow pool, the limestone shelf, and Skelton's path. She gave dates of storms and dry periods. Silas waited until she finished. Then he stood. Mrs. Chatto taught literature, did she not? I did, not hydrology. No, not surveying. No, your ledger uses poetic names for landscape features. Some. Skeleton's Path, for example. Yes, hardly a technical designation. No. His smile widened. And yet you ask this court to prefer your impressions to Mr. Graves's instrument. Miriam looked at the final survey map. No. I ask the court to notice that Mr. Graves's instrument cannot make water flow where there is none. A few people laughed. Judge Bell struck the desk with his knuckles. Silas's smile vanished, Miriam continued. 3 nights ago, during the storm, my husband and I observed actual flow in the wash. I recorded the time, direction, and termination point. The wash runs from the side canyon south and disappears into fractured limestone here. She pointed to her sketch. The Willow Spring emerges uphill and west, from a separate limestone seam. They are not one watercourse. Graves leaned forward. That proves nothing about subsurface connection. It proves your labeled creek does not run through the spring. Silas intervened. The legal boundary is based on historic channel identity, not a schoolteacher's field trip in the rain. Geronimo returned to the table. He opened the wooden document box. The room grew quieter. He unwrapped the Spanish grant. Judge Bell's tired expression sharpened. Geronimo carried it forward. This is an original grant recorded in 1682 and later recognized in territorial transfer records. Silas gave a short laugh. Recognized by whom? Geronimo turned toward him. By the authority you omitted from your filing. He looked back at the judge. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo requires the United States to respect property rights legally established before the transfer of this territory. Later confirmation records preserve this grant's water rights. Now the room was completely still. Geronimo spoke Spanish, not theatrically, not as a performance. He read the boundary clause from the old parchment, then translated it. The line follows living water from the Willow Spring to the Red Ridge, then south by the marked stones. Judge Bell held out his hand for the document. Arthur Sterling leaned toward Silas and whispered. Silas shook his head. Judge Bell studied the seal, then handed the grant to his clerk. Mr. Chatto, how did you obtain this? My grandfather kept it. My father hid it. I learned to read it. There was no boast in his voice. Martha Higgins had turned around on the bench. Her face was pale with surprise. Judge Bell looked at the map again. The syndicate's filing describes Highwater Creek as the same living water referenced here. Yes, Geronimo said. Silas stepped forward. Because it is. Geronimo turned to Graves. Then Mr. Graves can show the court where the creek touches the spring. Graves said nothing. Geronimo waited. The old silence returned, but now everyone in the room understood it as pressure rather than emptiness. Judge Bell tapped the desk. Mr. Graves? Graves cleared his throat. Subsurface hydrology can. On your map, Geronimo said. Where does the surface channel touch the spring? Graves looked at Silas. That glance did more damage than any answer. Miriam felt her pulse in her fingertips. Silas moved quickly. Your Honor. The witness is being badgered over an immaterial cartographic simplification. Is it immaterial? Judge Bell asked. Silas stopped. The judge turned the final map toward himself. If this creek defines the boundary, its position is the entire case. Arthur Sterling had begun rubbing his thumb along the paper edge again. Miriam knew that gesture. He was frightened. She watched him. Then she saw a second sheet partly exposed beneath his folder. Same map shape, different line. Your Honor, Miriam said. Silas's head turned. Mr. Sterling has another survey copy. Arthur went still. Silas said, he has working papers. Miriam pointed. May the court compare them? Arthur's face had lost all color. Judge Bell held out his hand. Mr. Sterling. For a moment, Arthur did not move. Then he pulled the sheet free. The clerk carried it to the judge. Miriam could see the difference from across the room. On the working copy, Highwater Creek followed the true dry wash. On the filed copy, it bent west toward the Willow Spring. Judge Bell looked up. Mr. Graves. Graves swallowed. Silas spoke before he could. Preliminary field maps are routinely corrected. Corrected based on what? Additional calculations. Show me the calculations. Silas glanced at Arthur. Arthur stared at the table. Judge Bell's voice hardened. Mr. Sterling. Arthur's shoulders sagged. There were no additional field calculations. The words barely carried. Silas turned on him. Arthur. Judge Bell raised his voice. Mr. Sterling, you are addressing the court now. Arthur removed his spectacles. His eyes met Miriam's for the first time. Shame had finally found him, years late. Mr. Graves produced the first draft after his site visit, Arthur said. Mr. Thorne objected that it did not support the syndicate's title position. Silas slammed a hand against the table. This is privileged. Sit down, Judge Bell said. Silas did not. The judge struck the desk. Sit down, he sat. Arthur continued, voice shaking. A revised boundary was prepared using the old federal reference to Highwater Creek. Who instructed the revision? Arthur looked toward Silas. That was enough, but Judge Bell made him say it. Mr. Thorne. A murmur rolled through the benches. Miriam felt no trust toward Arthur, only exhaustion. He had once had the chance to tell the truth before her life collapsed. He had chosen safety now. When Silas could no longer protect him, he had chosen himself again. The judge spent the next 20 minutes questioning Graves. Under pressure, the surveyor admitted that he had not observed permanent flow. He admitted that the final map moved the watercourse from his field sketch. He insisted he believed the change was supported by older records. Geronimo asked one final question. Did you tell me at my kitchen table that your official data did not lie? Graves looked at him. Yes. Geronimo nodded. No more questions. He sat beside Miriam. Under the table, their hands touched. Neither moved away. Judge Bell called a recess. The crowd spilled onto the porch. Miriam stayed inside. She did not want congratulations from people who had come hoping to see Geronimo humiliated. Martha approached anyway. Miriam. Miriam closed her ledger. Martha twisted her gloves. I had no idea he was. She stopped. Miriam waited. Educated. Martha finished weakly. Miriam looked toward Geronimo. He stood near a window speaking quietly with an elderly rancher in Spanish. You had enough information to know he was a man, she said. That should have been sufficient. Martha's cheeks reddened. Miriam did not wait for an apology. When Judge Bell returned, everyone stood. He read his ruling slowly. The syndicate's claim was dismissed. The ghost acreage designation could not be sustained because the filed survey depended on a materially altered watercourse. The Spanish grant would remain controlling pending formal archival review. The Willow Spring and Northern Pasture stayed with the Chatto Ranch. Then the judge looked at Graves and Arthur. He ordered the survey records preserved and referred the discrepancy for territorial investigation. Silas Thorne said nothing. His face had become gray beneath the careful grooming. Judge Bell finished. The room remained quiet for one long second. Geronimo wrapped the old grant in cloth. Miriam closed her ledger. No one cheered. That was better. The ruling was not magic. It did not erase the years Geronimo had spent hiding his knowledge or restore Miriam's career. It did not make the people in Silver Creek kinder. It simply stopped a theft. Sometimes that was enough for one day. Outside, the winter sun had dropped low. Geronimo offered Miriam his arm. She took it. They walked past Silas without looking at him. At the wagon, Arthur called her name. Miriam stopped but did not turn fully. I am sorry, he said. She studied him. For which part? He had no answer. Miriam climbed into the wagon. Geronimo took the reins. As they left Silver Creek, the courthouse disappeared behind a low cloud of road dust. Miriam did not look back again. They reached the ranch after dark. The horses were tired, and so were they. The cold had sharpened while they rode, making the stars appear close enough to strike with a thrown stone. Geronimo unhitched the team while Miriam carried the document box inside. When she opened the kitchen door, cedar smoke met her. He had banked the stove before they left. A red core still glowed beneath the ash. Miriam set the Spanish grant on the table. Only then did she notice the flowers. A small bunch of desert marigolds and dried buckwheat stood in a blue jar near her usual chair. The stems were uneven and tied with baling twine. She touched one papery yellow head. When did you do this? Geronimo came in carrying the harness. This morning. You picked flowers before a land hearing? They were beside the road. That does not answer the question. He hung the harness on a peg. Miriam waited. Finally he said, the table looked bare. That was all. She smiled at the flowers. They ate leftover stew standing near the stove because neither had the energy to set plates properly. Geronimo tore bread with his hands. Miriam drank coffee, though it was too late for coffee. Afterward, he disappeared into the cellar. When he returned, he carried a new leather-bound book. He placed it in front of her. The cover was plain. The paper inside was thick and cream-colored. Miriam ran a hand over the first blank page. "What is this, a ledger?" "I see that. For new work." She looked at the old book beside it. The first ledger had begun with dates of humiliation and ended with measurements that saved a spring. Its pages were crowded, stained, wrinkled from rain, and marked with ash. "What should I call this one?" Geronimo leaned against the table. "Something that does not begin with loss." Miriam considered. "Ledger of the Gila." He nodded once. She dipped a pen. "What do I write first?" Geronimo looked toward the dark window. The court ruling? She almost did. Then he shook his head. No. He pointed to the flowers. "Write that the marigold still had color after frost." Miriam looked up. "That is unexpectedly poetic. Do not tell anyone." She wrote the sentence. Below it, after a pause, she added that the old grant had come home intact. Geronimo read over her shoulder. This time he had permission. In the weeks after the hearing, nothing became easy. The ranch still required feed, fence wire, salt, and labor. A judge's order could not deepen a well or mend a roof. The winter storms had filled old ditches with branches and silt. 2 cows developed hoof trouble. A hinge broke on the barn door during the coldest week of January. But work felt different when it was pointed toward a future rather than merely away from disaster. The Spanish grant described an old irrigation system running from the willow spring toward the lower acreage. Geronimo had found remnants of the stone-lined channels years earlier, but had never restored them. Doing so openly while the title was threatened might have given the syndicate another reason to claim improvement value. Now they began. They started at the old headgate. Miriam wore trousers beneath a work skirt she had shortened to the calf and no longer cared what Martha would think of the arrangement. She swung a mattock until her shoulders burned. Geronimo pried limestone blocks from the silt. Together they cut mesquite roots from the abandoned channel. Some days they spoke. Most days they did not. Miriam discovered that shared labor produced its own grammar. A lifted chin meant bring the shovel. 2 taps on stone meant hold this. Geronimo's hand briefly at the middle of her back meant the footing ahead was loose. One afternoon they cleared the final obstruction near the lower field. Water came slowly. At first it was only a dark stain moving through dust. Then a trickle found the channel, curled around stone and continued. Miriam knelt. The water was cloudy with disturbed silt. She put her fingers into it anyway. Cold bit her skin. Geronimo crouched beside her. "It remembers." "What?" "The old path." Miriam watched the thin stream widen. "No," she said. "We reminded it." He thought about that. Maybe. By spring, grass grew in a strip where the restored ditch reached the lower field. The injured calf, now awkward and nearly grown, limped after the herd but kept up. Miriam wrote that into the new ledger too. She wrote fewer metaphors than before. Not because the land had become less beautiful, but because she no longer needed every sentence to prove she still possessed a mind. Some days a fact was enough. April 14. First swallow under barn roof. April 19. Willow flow steady after 3 dry weeks. May 2. Geronimo ruined biscuits while Miriam repaired east fence. Claims Stove was at fault. He read that entry and wrote beneath it in his firm hand. Stove has witnesses. Their first private letter came by accident. One evening Miriam found the scrap Geronimo had hidden in Don Quixote. She did not reread it. Instead she took a clean page and wrote her own. To the man who listens, the greeting embarrassed her so badly she nearly tore the page. She continued anyway. She described the irrigation water at noon, silver in the new channel. She wrote that she had once believed being understood would sound like someone answering every question. She had been wrong. Sometimes it sounded like a cup placed within reach, a door fitted with a lock, a calf stitched before comfort could begin, a man changing the strength of coffee without asking for gratitude. She left the letter on his pillow. The next morning it lay beside her cup, turned over. On the back Geronimo had written one sentence. "I heard you before I knew whether you would stay." Miriam read it twice. Then she carried the page to the table. Geronimo was outside saddling a horse. She did not call him in. Some answers deserved room. In May they returned to Silver Creek for supplies. The town treated them differently. Miriam disliked the difference almost as much as the old contempt. Men who once ignored Geronimo nodded too eagerly. A clerk at the feed store called him Mr. Chatto 3 times in one conversation. Martha waved from across the square. Geronimo accepted all of it with the same expression he had used when they insulted him. At Miller's Mercantile, however, one habit had not changed. Geronimo brought in 3 tanned hides and a crate of cedar bowls to trade for seed, lamp oil, and salt. Miller weighed the hides. His thumb rested against the scale arm. Miriam saw it. So did Geronimo. Neither spoke. Miller announced a total lower than the market value. Miriam leaned on the counter. Again, Miller looked at her. Beg pardon? Weigh them again without your thumb. A boy near the flour barrel snorted. Miller's face reddened. Mrs. Chatto, I have weighed hides for 20 years. Then you should have learned where to put your hand. The store went quiet. Geronimo inspected a box of nails as if the matter did not concern him. Miller removed his thumb and reweighed. The total rose. Miriam opened the current Territorial Gazette, and the hide price is 9 cents higher than the figure on your slate. Miller looked toward Geronimo. Your wife always conduct your business now? Geronimo set down the nails. No, Miller waited. Geronimo pointed to the scale. Today you made it hers. The boy by the flour laughed openly. Miller corrected the price. Outside, Miriam climbed onto the wagon. You could have said something sooner. You were enjoying yourself. That is the second time you have used that excuse. It remains useful. On the road home, they stopped at the willow spring. The water ran clear. Willow leaves had returned, narrow and pale green. New grass softened the bank. Miriam sat on Reader's step. Geronimo watered the horses. A child appeared on the ridge. She was perhaps 9 thin, with a dark braid and a flour sack tied around schoolbooks. Miriam recognized her as Elena Ruiz, daughter of a Mexican family living near the old mine road. Mrs. Chatto? Yes? The girl came closer. My mother says you used to teach. I did. Can you help me read this? She held out a damaged primer. Miriam took it. Where is your school? Elena looked at the ground. The town school. Then why are you asking me? The child shrugged. Mr. Hale says I am behind and he does not have time. Miriam opened the primer. 3 pages were loose. What word? Elena pointed. Miriam sounded it with her. Geronimo finished with the horses and Wada without interrupting. They spent 20 minutes on the bank. When Elena left, she carried the primer more carefully than before. Miriam watched her disappear along the trail. I miss it, she said. Geronimo knew what she meant. Teaching, yes. He sat beside her. The school letter? No. Miriam looked at the spring. I don't miss the academy. I miss the moment when someone realizes the marks on a page belong to them too. Geronimo picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. The barn has space. Miriam looked at him. For what? He raised one eyebrow. She laughed. No, why? Because cattle and grammar are natural enemies. We can move the tack. You are serious. Yes. What would the town say? Geronimo threw the stone. It skipped twice across the pool. Miriam answered her own question. Nothing worth hearing. That summer the ranch barn acquired 4 desks. Geronimo built them from cedar planks left from a repaired fence. He sanded each surface until Miriam could run a hand across it without finding a splinter. She gathered discarded primers from Silver Creek, repaired their bindings, and bought a second slate with money from the hides Miller had finally priced honestly. Elena came first, then her younger brother. A miner's son arrived 2 days later. A widowed ranch hand brought twin girls who had never attended school regularly because the trip to town took half a day. Miriam taught 3 mornings a week. She did not recreate the academy. There were no uniforms, no polished halls, and no speeches about refinement. Children arrived with dust on their boots and chores waiting at home. They learned letters, sums, history, and enough practical law to recognize their own names on a contract. Geronimo sometimes worked at a bench in the back of the barn while she taught. At first, the children whispered about him. Elena asked the question directly. Mr. Chatto, is it true you can read Spanish? Geronimo looked up from a bridle. Yes, better than Mrs. Chatto? Miriam put down the chalk, Geronimo considered. Older Spanish. Elena's eyes widened. Miriam crossed her arms. Careful. He returned to the bridle. The children laughed. The sound filled the barn rafters. On the first morning, Miriam called the barn a school instead of simply lessons. She woke before Geronimo. That alone pleased her. She lit the stove, mixed cornmeal with yesterday's milk, and fried small cakes in bacon grease, while the sky beyond the kitchen window turned from black to pearl. Geronimo came in from the yard carrying an armful of split cedar. You are early, he said. I am the schoolmistress. You were the schoolmistress yesterday. Yesterday I had 3 pupils and a crate. Today I have 7 pupils and actual desks. He set down the wood. Then the desks deserved breakfast. By 7, children were appearing along the ranch road in 1s and 2s. Elena carried a slate under her arm. The Beck twins arrived on a sway-backed pony and argued about who had held the reins. A miner named Samuel Pike brought his son all the way to the door, hat twisting in his hands. "Can't pay much," he told Miriam. "You can repair the west window frame. I can do that. Then we are square." Samuel looked toward Geronimo, who was fitting a peg into the final desk. "That agreeable to you?" Geronimo did not look up. "She runs the school." Samuel nodded slowly, as if that answer told him something larger than the words themselves. The first lesson went badly. A chalk stick snapped. One child cried because another laughed at his reading. A gust through the open barn door sent 3 loose worksheets skittering under the feed bins. The Beck twins discovered that whispering carried farther in a barn than in any proper classroom Miriam had ever taught. At 10, a chicken wandered inside. Geronimo caught it under one arm and continued listening while Miriam explained fractions with dried beans. "1/2, she said, dividing 12 beans. The chicken clucked. "Mr. Chatto appears to disagree." The children laughed. Geronimo looked down at the bird. "She has not studied." He carried it outside. By noon, Miriam's throat was dry and the neat braid she had pinned that morning was falling apart. She stood in the doorway, watching the children eat lunches wrapped in cloth. Elena shared an apple with her brother. The Beck twins tried to calculate how many fence posts would fit around a square pasture. Samuel Pike's son sat on the ground, sounding out a headline from an old newspaper. Geronimo came beside her. "Too loud?" she asked. He considered the barn. A slate scraped. Someone sneezed. A child shouted that the chicken had returned. No. Miriam looked at him. Years of his life had been built around not being noticed, not being overheard, not revealing more than an enemy expected. Now 7 children were filling his barn with questions. "Too many words?" she asked. He shook his head. "Different words." Miriam understood. That afternoon, after the last child had gone home, she found a small carving on the corner of the newest desk. 2 crooked letters, E and R. Her first instinct was the old school teacher's outrage. Then she ran a thumb over the marks. "Elena?" Geronimo asked. "Probably. Sand it out?" Miriam thought of polished academy desks where students were forbidden to leave any trace of themselves. "No." She closed the barn door. "Leave it." Geronimo looked at the carving once more. Then he nodded. Months passed. The territorial investigation into Graves's survey moved slowly, as investigations did. Graves lost his survey commission while the matter was pending. Silas Thorne returned east before anyone in Silver Creek knew whether he would be charged. Arthur Sterling sent Miriam one letter. She left it unopened for a week. Then she read it. Arthur apologized again. He explained too much. He wrote about pressure, fear, professional ruin, Silas's influence. Miriam folded the letter. She did not burn it. She placed it in the old ledger beside the board notice from Pennsylvania. Not all evidence needed destruction. Some things were useful because they showed exactly what a person had chosen. She did not answer. Late that autumn, Miriam realized she was pregnant. The knowledge came quietly. A missed cycle. A second. The smell of frying salt pork suddenly unbearable. A fatigue different from ranch work. She told Geronimo at the kitchen table. He was sharpening a pencil for one of the school children. "I believe there will be another student." He looked at the pencil, then at her. Miriam waited. Geronimo set the knife down with extreme care. "Are you certain?" "As certain as one can be at this stage." He stood, sat again. Miriam had never seen him at a loss for physical action. "Say something," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. The question undid her. "Not are you happy? Not is it mine? Not what will we call it? Are you afraid?" Miriam thought. "Yes." Geronimo nodded. "So am I." She reached across the table. He took her hand. The fear did not disappear. It became shared. During winter evenings, Geronimo expanded the barn school by another row of benches. Miriam accused him of planning for a population explosion. He said the desks were for children, not all of them theirs. She told him she was relieved. He built a cradle next. The new ledger changed again. Alongside water levels and cattle births appeared notes about the school. Elena Ruiz read a full page without help. Thomas Beck finally stopped reversing his sevens. Geronimo taught 4 children how to measure a fence line with chain and compass. Then, one rainy evening, Miriam opened to a clean page. She began a letter to the child she had not yet met. She did not tell the child that the ranch had saved her. That was too simple. The ranch had hurt her hands, frightened her, exposed her pride, and demanded work she had not known how to do. Geronimo had not rescued her from that. He had given her room to decide whether she would stay in it. She wrote instead about the spring, about the old grant hidden for years in oilcloth. About a man who learned to read because other men used paper as a weapon. About a woman who wrote because she feared silence would erase her. She wrote that they had both been wrong in different ways. She had thought words proved depth. He had thought hiding depth guaranteed safety. Their life had required both speech and silence, ink and stone, law and weather. Geronimo entered while she was writing. Wood shavings clung to his shirt. Miriam moved the ledger toward him. "Read it." He did. His eyes moved slowly down the page. At the bottom she had written, "Whatever name you carry, know that no paper can tell you what a person is worth." Read the paper. Geronimo's mouth moved slightly. "That sounds like me." "It should." "I stole half your philosophy." "Only half? Do not become vain." She held out the pen. He took it. His signature was firm and dark beneath hers. No X, no disguise. Geronimo Chatto. He put the pen down. Miriam leaned back in the chair. Rain tapped the shutters. From the barn came the faint smell of fresh cedar where the new desks waited for morning. The old house was still plain. The roof still leaked near the pantry in a hard east wind. The stove smoked when the flue needed cleaning. Dust found its way beneath every door in summer. Miriam loved none of those things. Home, she had learned, did not require pretending hardship was beautiful. It required knowing which hardships belonged to a life one had chosen. Geronimo stood behind her chair and rested a hand on her shoulder. She covered it with hers. Outside, water moved through the restored irrigation channel toward the lower field. The willow spring ran in the dark, unseen but steady. Miriam thought of her first night at the ranch, of the trunk she had dragged across the threshold, and the ugly sentence she had written about the man in the other room. She did not tear that page out. Once she might have. Now she left it where it was. The error belonged to the record too. Without it, the later pages would pretend understanding had come easily. It had not. It had come through blistered palms, an injured calf, bitter coffee, a stolen look into a cellar full of books, rain on a false boundary, frightened testimony, and two people learning when to speak. Geronimo looked toward the window. "The rain is easing." Miriam listened. He was right. The hard drumming had softened to a steady whisper. "Tomorrow the ditch will need clearing." "Yes." "The children will arrive before breakfast if Elena has anything to say about it." "Yes." "And the south fence still leans." "Yes." Miriam sighed. "You are ruining the moment." Geronimo bent and kissed the top of her head. It was a small gesture, almost shy. "The moment has chores." She laughed. They turned down the lamp and stood together by the window. Clouds were breaking above the ridge. A few stars appeared in the gaps. The ranch lay dark around them. Barn, corrals, school desks, cattle, the narrow, shining thread of water. Nothing about it looked like a kingdom. That was another word Miriam no longer needed. It was land they had defended, work they shared, a house with two voices and room for quiet. When Geronimo opened the door, the air smelled of wet creosote and cold earth. Miriam stepped onto the porch beside him. She could hear the spring in the distance if she listened carefully. Not loud, not empty, enough.